Did you get your 10,000 steps in today? Is this a marketing gimmick or the secret to good health? Is sitting really the new smoking? All of this and more on today's episode of The Secret Life of Numbers. Welcome to the Secret Life of Numbers podcast, the podcast where we dissect everyday numbers and statistics to find the stories behind them.
Each episode, we take a number or statistic and break it down. We will tell you where it comes from and what it means for you. Along the way, hopefully we will inspire you to think about the numbers in your own life.
I'm Levannia, your data scientist on call. I'll be breaking down the numbers.
I'm Lindsay, your data translator. For when Levannia gets too technical on us, I'll be breaking down the rest.
All right, let's jump in. I have a question for you, Lindsay. Do you wear a fitness tracking device?
So I have an Apple Watch, and I wear it. Well, okay. So during COVID, I don't wear it all the time because I'm like, it's slightly depressing to see that I've taken...
You don't want that judgment.
Yeah, I mean, you get a notification. It's like, congrats, you've taken 10 steps today. And it's like, oh, awesome. But I do really like wearing it when I'm working out. Like, it's nice to track how far I've been running. And I do enjoy wearing one. What about you?
I do. I have a Garmin watch that I use. I used to wear it pretty religiously throughout the day in like the before times.
Way back in the day.
But then I noticed it like suspiciously or secretly changed my step goal from 10,000 steps to a little bit lower. And I just really wasn't there for that kind of judgment about my movement. So
it's like we're in lockdown and we're stuck in our apartments. Like, what are you expecting?
Yeah. So I stopped wearing it in the apartment during the day, but I do wear it while I exercise as well. And I actually particularly like the sleep tracking it in my device.
Oh, do you wear it to bed?
Sometimes, yeah. It knows a lot about me, my Garmin watch.
Knows you the best. So I guess without further delay, let's get started. Today we're talking about 10,000 steps.
Yes, I feel like 10,000 steps is so ubiquitous now. Like, that's just a number that you need to achieve.
And the one thing that's really weird about it is it's so pervasive in society, but then I'm like, where did this number come from? At some point, someone said, we need 10,000 steps. And I'm wondering where the science is behind it.
I can tell you where it came from. And it's interesting because there is some science surrounding it, but how we got there is a bit of a roundabout story.
Ooh, story time.
This number really started floating around 10,000 steps a day around 1964 when the Tokyo Olympics were occurring in Japan. And at this time, the Japanese population was really interested in regular exercise and how it was a good way to fight against diseases such as hypertension, diabetes, and stroke. As well as obesity. One of these modern pedometers was introduced to the Japanese marketplace at roughly around the same time. It's very simple compared to what we know today. And it was called, I hope I pronounce this right, the Manpokai, which literally means 10,000 steps in the Japanese language. And that really became like the rallying slogan for like dedicated walkers. Because when you think about exercise, one of the easiest ways to exercise would be to walk, and one of the most inexpensive ways.
I remember, obviously not in 1964 because I wasn't born yet, but in like the early 2000s, there was kind of a surge of pedometers and 10,000 steps, like almost a renewal of this. And I remember my dad at work, they put different staff members on different teams and gave them all pedometers, and the team that got the most steps, I think in a month or a week or something, they got a special prize or like a party or I don't know what it was. I was still pretty young, but I remember my dad gave us his pedometer
to get steps for him.
to get steps. So we go run around in the yard or we jump up and down. I don't know if his team won, though, so I don't know if it made a difference.
What actually happened in Japan was like walking clubs started to appear. And then this 10,000 was the minimum to be in the walking club. And then gradually that concept, as you're saying, kind of spread all over the world to your dad competing at work.
Trying to win the pizza party. I'm not sure what it was, but there was something that sounded pretty cool. So I guess it really almost was born out of marketing in a sense.
So in a sense, 10,000 steps kind of came because we thought it sounded cool. But when people started walking for 10,000 steps a day, it kind of created this research field or this research topic area where people started researching, is 10,000 steps going to help you? Like, is it enough steps or is it too many steps? Like, these were the types of questions they were asking.
So I guess this is a good example of we come up with the number first because we think it sounds good, and then we do the science and the research to see if it's actually good.
Agreed. I think we often think that science informs the public view, but it can also work in the opposite direction. Like the public view can inform science.
Really interesting. So is 10,000 steps enough? Is that what we're supposed to be doing? What does the research say?
Well, I'm not sure if it's enough, but I'll run you through a couple of studies. So one of them that I was able to find that's pretty comprehensive was done at Ghent University by the Department of Movement and Sports Medicine in Belgium. And they conducted a study on the validity of increased physical activity helping with improving overall health for an individual. And it was done from 2005 to 2006, and about 866 participants underwent the 10,000 steps per day fitness plan. And their progress was tracked by the researchers with pedometers, physical activity questionnaires, and an activity log that had questions related to awareness of the project. And the people that participated in this study were people who were looking to improve their general health of well-being, and there were others who were at risk of chronic diseases such as obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular diseases, as well as osteoporosis. So, Lindsay, I have a question. Do you think this intervention was successful?
I mean, how long did the study run for?
It lasted for the year in 2005, and then they came back for a follow-up 4 years later.
Okay, I feel like a year is a really long time to strictly try to get 10,000 steps every day as part of a study. So I'm guessing it was kind of halfway compliance, like maybe half the study participants. And then follow-up was quite a bit later. So I think there'd be quite a big drop there.
I feel like you know all my secrets. So you're right. Like the intervention was highly successful for the participants who were able to complete the daily 10,000 step challenge successfully. They felt they were in better health, and there was an overall sense of well-being in those participants. But as you mentioned, it was about only half of those participants that were able to meet the 10,000 steps. When they followed up 4 years later, only half of them were available for follow-up, and a step count decrease was seen across the board. And some of the things that they attributed to this decrease was aging, as well as things like community awareness.
I think that's interesting that it decreased across the board, even for people who felt that they had benefits and felt an overall improvement in their well-being.
I mean, 10,000 steps is a lot. When I track it on my pedometer, it's a lot of steps. Like that's about 5 kilometers for me in walking.
Well, part of what I wonder about 10,000 steps too, is it about how many steps, or is it about how fast you're stepping? Is it about getting your heart rate up? Is it about, more like the rate and the rhythm of the walking?
Well, I don't know if we'll get into that here, but there is some research as well to be like, is it about the number of the steps, or is it about the activity that you experience during those steps? That's what creates the benefit to you.
Right. Is it just about getting moving and giving someone some motivation, maybe, to achieve that?
So we've done a little bit of a review of 10,000 steps and its research. When we come back after the break, Lindsay's going to talk a little bit about the impact that this has on us in our everyday lives.
Welcome back, everyone. So now it's time to talk about what do the actual physical activity guidelines say? Do we really need to get 10,000 steps? So because we're in Canada, I looked at the Canadian Physical Activity Guidelines. The recommendations for adults aged 18 to 64 is to achieve at least 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous intensity aerobic exercise in 10-minute bouts or more every week.
What's the difference between aerobic and anaerobic?
Aerobic it's like cardio, right? Like anaerobic would be just lifting weights.
Okay.
For example, moderate activities that they suggest are brisk walking or biking, whereas vigorous would be a little bit more cardio intensive. So jogging, for example, or cross-country skiing.
Okay, so brisk walking is not just leisurely walking that your Fitbit or your Garmin watch is picking up.
You could think of it as power walking, maybe. And then they don't just recommend aerobic exercise. They also recommend at least 2 days a week doing muscle and bone strengthening in major muscle groups. Lifting weights, for example, or you could do like a circuit where you use your body weight if you don't want to lift weights.
Or you're in a small apartment and don't necessarily own weights.
Or if you're in a small apartment and like you can't go to the gym because they're all closed. And in general, the more you do, the better it is. Obviously, to a point. If you're running ultra marathons every single day, it might be hard on your body. But in general, 150 minutes is your baseline that you want to be hitting. One of the things that I found really interesting is that every year Canadians get a report card for how well they are doing at meeting the physical activity guidelines.
Oh, no. Do we get an A? Do Canadians get an A?
Well, what do you think?
I think we might get a solid B-.
Wow. That was, that's optimistic, shall we say.
Okay.
So Canadians actually got a failing grade.
Oh, no.
In their 2019 report card from Participaction is the organization that kind of accumulates all the data and then aggregates it and puts it out in really easy to read reports. 52% of Canadians in 2016 to 2017, aged 18 to 79 years old, took a minimum of 7,500 steps per day.
Okay.
So a smaller subset of that 52% would actually be meeting that 10,000 steps a day that we were talking about.
Yes.
And unfortunately, 29% of Canadians fell into the category of having a low active lifestyle.
So almost a third of Canadians have a low activity lifestyle.
Yes. And 18% of Canadians take less than 5,000 steps a day. Now, keep in mind, these numbers are not from during COVID. It'll be really interesting once the 2020 and 2021 numbers are reported. 2019 was the most recent one that I could have. And then as far as whether or not we achieved a minimum of 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity in bouts of 10 minutes or more every week, only 16% of adults were able to achieve that. So this is your sign to listen to this podcast while you're out for a brisk walk or doing whatever physical activity feels good for you. So I guess a question is, okay, if, most Canadians aren't achieving these goals, what's the big deal?
What are some of the benefits that we're missing out on? Because I'm guessing there are benefits because these guidelines exist.
Yes. And I think in general, we know that exercise is good for us, but there are specific things. So part of the importance of being active for 150 minutes every week, it helps reduce the risk of death, heart disease, stroke, hypertension, which is high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, osteoporosis, obesity, and it helps improve your fitness, strength, and mental health. Honestly, we could talk for hours about the different mechanisms that this works under, but a really cool example with type 2 diabetes is that exercise helps improve insulin-independent glucose uptake, which lowers your A1C, which is the blood test that you would do to see how you're doing with your sugar control.
Okay.
So with type 2 diabetes specifically, you have enough insulin to help lower your blood sugar, but it's not being recognized by the different receptors in your body to take up the sugar. So when you're exercising, it can help improve that uptake regardless of the insulin level.
Oh, okay.
So it helps lower your blood sugar, which is really cool. Obviously, it's not going to be a silver bullet that suddenly, you walk 10 minutes a day and diabetes is cured.
But it's better than nothing. It's like part of your management, let's say.
I think it's part of the whole picture, exactly. And one thing that's really cool about the Canadian physical activity guidelines is that they do a really good job of outlining different recommendations by age group. And also they have specific guidelines for people during pregnancy, as well as people with multiple sclerosis. Now, to drill down a little bit more into some of the benefits of exercise, I took a look at exerciseismedicine.org, which is a website that's supported by the American College of Sports Medicine. One of the things that I really liked about the way that they broke down the different benefits from exercise is they did it by age group. So in kids, exercise helps improve cognitive function, it helps improve your bone health, and it helps improve your mental health. In adults, it helps reduce your risk of dementia, it improves your quality of life, and it can help reduce feelings of anxiety and depression and improve that cognitive functioning. And in older adults specifically, it helps improve your physical function, as well as helps reduce the number of fall-related injuries, which is, of course, very important as we grow older.
So, Lindsay, we've kind of outlined a lot of the benefits of exercising, but what are the dangers associated with the opposite, being sedentary?
I'm so glad you asked, because this was my question too. Can I sit for the other non-150 minutes a week and still be healthy? So the answer is there's a lot of dangers with a sedentary lifestyle. So there's been studies that have come out recently that have been collated by the American Heart Association that concludes that no matter how physically active someone is, prolonged sedentary behavior isn't canceled out, and it can still negatively affect your heart and cardiovascular health. So there was this really great article in The Atlantic about this research, and I love the analogy that they use. One of the lines in the article is that a salad doesn't undo a cigarette.
Very true.
But we have this mentality when it comes to exercise that no matter what we do in the rest of our day, as long as we exercise, it's okay. So there was a systematic review published in The Lancet that found that high levels of moderate intensity physical activity does reduce the risks from high sitting time, but it doesn't eliminate the risk with high TV viewing time. So there was actually this distinction between sitting, for example, for work, and then sitting on the couch for hours watching Netflix.
Binge watching.
I feel personally attacked. I'm kidding. It's interesting that this research is coming out now that it's not necessarily enough just to be physically active, that we also want to be incorporating movement into our whole day.
So, Lindsay, I've heard this phrase that sitting is the new smoking. It kind of sounds like that might be the case.
This is a hot topic. As far as I could find, it came out of an interview with Dr. James Levine from the Mayo Clinic, which is down in the States, with the LA Times, where he's quoted as saying, "Sitting is more dangerous than smoking, kills more people than HIV, and is more treacherous than parachuting. We are sitting ourselves to death. The chair is out to kill us."
Those are fighting words.
These are very strong statements, right? So of course it's going to be picked up by other media outlets. Of course it's going to spur on, kind of like the 10,000 steps, a whole new area of what's the science behind this? Is sitting really killing us?
Yeah.
I had a lot of questions, as we do. I'm like, show me the science. Show me the relative risk. So I found this article in the American Journal of Public Health that was published in 2018. And it provided a review of the current research in this area. There's a few things that I think are really interesting here. So we're going to dive into it. And Levannia, you're going to love this. There's numbers.
Oh, you know how I feel about numbers.
So they did an overview of a meta-analysis that was conducted on sedentary behavior. Mm-hmm. And a meta-analysis is really an aggregation of data from multiple studies that are all analyzed together.
Yeah, they scrape the data from multiple studies and analyze it all at once.
So you get a bigger sample size, but then there's also risks with what if the studies weren't conducted similarly.
Yeah, you can introduce bias if you're not careful.
Yes. So I'm going to have to introduce a few slightly technical terms.
But our listeners are never afraid of slightly technical terms.
So the first term we're going to talk about is a hazard ratio.
Okay.
A hazard ratio is just kind of exactly what it sounds like. It's an assessment of the hazard of something happening with an intervention. So a hazard ratio is a number between 0 and, really, it can go quite high. Having a hazard ratio of 1 means that there's no difference, right? So if you're, for example, here, if the hazard ratio crossed 1 with sitting, it's not significant for sitting increases risk of death, for example.
Okay.
But if the hazard ratio is less than 1, there's a decreased risk.
Okay. So there would be like a decreased hazard ratio for walking 10,000 steps.
Yes, for example. And then if a hazard ratio is greater than 1, there's an increased risk. So that comes back to our sitting example. The meta-analysis found that sedentary behavior has a hazard ratio of 1.22 for all-cause mortality.
All-cause mortality is just death caused by anything?
Yes, when compared to people who didn't have sedentary behaviors. The confidence interval didn't cross 1, so this is a significant hazard ratio for sedentary behavior being associated with all-cause mortality. So that's not looking great, right?
No, that doesn't look promising for me and my 8 hours a day at the desk.
But the question isn't, does sedentary behavior increase the risk of all-cause mortality? It's how does it stack up to smoking? So with smoking, we looked at something called relative risk, which is, again, a ratio, and it compares the probability or chance of having a certain outcome, which in this case, we're looking at death or mortality, in a group with an exposure intervention. So in this case, the group with the exposure would be the group that smokes. And then the control group would be people who don't smoke. So we're looking at, does the relative risk of death increase for people who smoke?
All right.
One thing that's cool about relative risk is that it follows that same pattern as hazard ratio of, if it crosses 1, it's not significant. If it's less than 1, there's a decrease. If it's more than 1, there's an increase. So the relative risk of death from all causes in people who smoke is 2.8 in men and 2.76 in women. And the confidence interval doesn't cross 1, so we're confident that this is significant. Now, if we look at people who smoke more than 40 cigarettes a day, the relative risk of death from all causes increases to 4.08 in men and 4.41 in women. So there's a bit of a dose-dependent relationship here. But one of the things is, okay, maybe we're comparing a little bit apples and oranges here with sitting and smoking because we have a hazard ratio and a relative risk. So let's look at them on an even playing field.
I was just about to be like, Lindsay, you gave me 2 numbers, but how do I compare them? You knew exactly what I was going to ask you.
I've known you long enough to know that you're like, wait, where's the equivalency? Allow me to introduce to you our friend absolute risk difference. Absolute risk difference is the absolute difference in outcomes. Again, in this case, we're looking at all-cause mortality or all-cause death between a treatment group. In this case, the treatment group is either the smoking group or the sedentary group versus the control group, which is the group that doesn't smoke or the group that is physically active.
Okay.
So for smoking, for every 100,000 people per year, there's 2,000 excess deaths from any cause in the heaviest smokers versus non-smokers. Now, for a sedentary lifestyle, per 100,000 people per year, there's an excess 190 deaths in the group with the highest volume of sitting versus the lowest.
So smoking is worse.
Yes, purely from an absolute risk difference.
Okay.
One of the important things about this review, the point of it wasn't to say that sedentary behavior is good. They do give a survey of recent research that excessive sitting nearly doubles the risk of type 2 diabetes, for example. But sitting and mortality isn't a perfect linear relationship. It's dose dependent. And one of the things that I found interesting is some guidelines, they don't talk about total amount of sitting. They talk about what do you do when you're not at work, because a lot of us don't have control over whether or not we're sitting at work. Absolute risk difference, what we talked about with the 2,000 excess deaths per year per 100,000 for smoking and the 190 for sitting, isn't the only metric to look at. Another metric in this review that they looked at was annual global cost attributed to sitting versus smoking. Which one do you think has a larger annual global cost?
I want to say smoking.
Winner, winner, chicken dinner. So you're totally right, Levannia. In 2012, the annual global cost attributed to smoking was $467 billion. And in 2013 for sitting, it was $53.8 billion. So there is a higher global cost attributed with smoking.
But neither of them are good for you.
But I think the comparison between sitting and smoking is kind of an apples and oranges comparison in a lot of ways. There's a lot of different considerations, right? So, for example, with smoking, there's consequences to the people around you with secondhand smoke. With sitting, not so much. And then there's also this whole debate of addiction versus habit, right? Nicotine is very addicting, but sitting isn't addicting, it's a habit.
So I guess it's easier to stop sitting than it is to stop smoking.
It's incredibly challenging to stop smoking. And then there's also been some criticisms of the review, not so much the statement of sitting versus the new smoking. But one of the criticisms was that the incidence of smoking is declining. Although I think what we're really seeing now is this rise in vaping, which we don't have the same long-term studies that we do as smoking.
We don't yet know what effects it has.
So I think it might be a little premature to say the new generations coming up don't smoke as often because
we don't have the data yet to know.
Exactly. And then the criticism, too, is that sedentary behavior is increasing, like with all of the gadgets that we have. And
yeah, the binge watching of Netflix and
the allure of that red screen. So I think in ways we're comparing two different public health crises. Is sitting the new smoking? Probably not. But like they said, a salad doesn't undo a cigarette. We've talked a lot today about 10,000 steps, about sedentary behavior, and we've hinted a little bit at struggles during a global pandemic of maintaining our personal fitness goals. I think it's really important to wrap up an episode all about fitness and exercise and getting those steps with an honest reflection of where we've been at for the past year and a bit.
Agreed. I guess for me, it has not been great. Like I've tried to maintain my level of fitness, but it was difficult because the gyms were closed. Many of the places I would go to exercise are no longer open to me. And then you also can't go outside for long periods of time either. And then when you go outside, there's the risk of who are you in contact with, etc. So I've been able to take classes at lunchtime, and I really enjoy that. But certainly, I found it very difficult to maintain my fitness during the pandemic.
It's been really challenging. I've been in medical school this past year, which at Zoom School of Medicine is quite a bit of online. Although we've been very lucky to have chances to get into the clinic and get to see real patients, all of that good stuff. I remember specifically, I think it was diabetes week. We were learning all about diabetes. And we had a lot of lectures about like lifestyle modifications and like lifestyle changes you can make to be healthy. You know, a lot of these lectures are recorded, so I'm literally watching them on my couch. And I just remember hearing all of this really good information about how we're supposed to be active and stay active. And at that time, I think it got dark around 4 p.m. School ended at 5. You had to make dinner. And I was so burnt out after a full 8 to 10 hour day of Zoom that the only thing I could find the energy to do was to lay on the couch and watch some Netflix before going to bed and starting all over the next day.
Yeah. I mean, it was very much the same for me. In the before times, I would like wake up, go to work, and I wouldn't go home. I would go to the gym or do whatever physical activity before going home because home has its own like draw to it. Home is cozy. Home has Netflix. But now I'm always here, so that I can understand how it's difficult to find the time to exercise or the motivation, really.
One thing that did help, though, was I got an exercise ball. And so I'd sit on the exercise ball while I did lectures. And that helped me, first of all, stay really engaged because you're
moving around always.
If you start to zone out, you're going down.
For me, it was about creating something that was easily accessible to me.
Yeah. And something that you enjoy, too, because I think that's so important. Like, find that activity that you forget that you're exercising because you genuinely enjoy doing it.
Agreed. All right, Lindsay, do you know what time it is?
I think I do. It's time to plant our science seed.
It is. So each episode, we like to give our listeners something to think about, a science nugget to help you think more critically about the numbers, statistics, and really the science you hear every day. So what we wanted to talk about today is often when we hear studies of things like exercise being related to mental health, for example, where you have two variables and you have a relationship, you wonder whether or not it's correlation or is it causation. So we wanted to give some definitions of those things. So correlation is a relationship between two random variables. And just for some background, you can hear positive correlation or negative correlation. So positive means as one variable increases, the other also increases, and negative is as one increases, the other decreases. And then causation is actually cause and effect relationship. So this effect or this event causes the other to occur.
I think there's some really interesting examples of correlation and causation being conflated. You want to hear some fun examples?
Yes.
Okay, so there's this one theory. I mean, theory is kind of too strong of a word for this. So there was this suggestion that there's a relationship between the stock market and the length of skirt that is in fashion. And that like as skirt length increases, the stock market changes in a certain direction. And then as the skirts get shorter, it goes in the other direction. And like you can actually graph it out. But
I'm pretty sure that's a correlation, not necessarily a causation relationship.
Another example is that ice cream and drownings are positively correlated. But one of the things about correlation versus causation is with a correlation, we miss confounding variables.
Mm-hmm.
Increasing ice cream sales doesn't increase drownings. Summer does because people are out swimming.
Exactly.
So one of the important things with a correlation is to think about the confounding variables. And those have to be accounted for in order to design a study that can give us confidence in a causal relationship.
Yeah. And this is what a lot of these studies are doing to make sure that they can tell you that, in fact, taking 10,000 steps a day is a causal relationship. Thanks for listening, everyone. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you find your podcasts. You can find the references we use for this episode in our show notes. A special thank you to Julian Bertino, who does our sound editing and music.
Have an idea of what number we should cover next? Want to learn more about what we talked about today? Follow us on Instagram at The Secret Life of Numbers.
We'll catch you next time on The Secret Life of Numbers, where the numbers can run,
but they can't hide.